Daguerreotype process, or daguerreotypy, was the first publicly announced photographic process, and for nearly 20 years, it was the one most commonly used. It was invented by Louis-Jaques-Mandé Daguerre and introduced worldwide in 1839. By 1860, new processes which were less expensive and produced more easily viewed images had almost completely replaced it. During the past few decades, there has been a small-scale revival of daguerreotypy among photographers interested in making artistic use of early photographic processes. To make a daguerreotype, the daguerreotypist would polish a sheet of silver-plated copper to a mirror finish, treat it with fumes that made its surface light-sensitive, expose it in a camera for as long as was judged to be necessary, which could be as little as a few seconds for brightly sunlit subjects, so much longer with less intense lighting, make the resulting latent image on it visible by fuming it with mercury vapor, remove its sensitivity to light by liquid chemical treatment, rinse and dry it, then seal the easily marred result behind glass in a protective enclosure. Viewing a daguerreotype is unlike looking at any other type of photograph. The image does not sit on the surface of the metal, but appears to be floating in space, and the illusion of reality, especially with examples that are sharp and well exposed, is unique to the process. The image is on a mirror-like silver surface, normally kept under glass, and will appear either positive or negative, depending on the angle at which it is viewed, how it is lit, and whether a lighted dark background is being reflected in the metal. The darkest areas of the image are simply bare silver. Lighter areas have a microscopically fine light scattering texture. The surface is very delicate, and even the lightest wiping can permanently scuff it. Some tarnish around the edges as normal, and any treatment to remove it should be done only by a specialized conservator. Several types of antique photographs, most often ambrotypes and tintypes, but sometimes even old prints on paper, are very commonly misidentified as daguerreotypes, especially if they are in the small, ornamented cases in which daguerreotypes made in the US and UK were usually housed. The name daguerreotype correctly refers only to one very specific image type and medium, the product of a process that was in wide use only from the early 1840s to the late 1850s. History. Since the Renaissance era, artists and inventors had searched for a mechanical method of capturing visual scenes. Previously, using the camera obscura, artists would manually trace what they saw, or use the optical image in the camera as a basis for solving the problems of perspective and parallax, and deciding color values. The camera obscura's optical reduction of a real scene in three-dimensional space to a flat rendition in 2 dimensions influenced Western art, so that at one point, it was thought that images based on optical geometry belonged to a more advanced civilization. Later, with the advent of modernism, the absence of perspective in Oriental art from China, Japan and in Persian miniatures was revalued. In the early 17th century, the Italian physician and chemist Angelo Sala wrote that powdered silver nitrate was blackened by the sun, but did not find any practical application of the phenomenon. The discovery and commercial availability of the halides, iodine, bromine and chlorine meant that the silver photographic processes became feasible. Previous discoveries of photosensitive methods and substances, including silver nitrate by Albertus Magnus in the 13th century, a silver and chalk mixture by Johann Heinrich Schulze in 1724, and Joseph Nie acute PCE's bitumen-based heliography in 1822 contributed to development of the daguerreotype. The first reliably documented attempt to capture the image formed in a camera obscura was made by Thomas Wedgwood as early as the 1790s, but according to an 1802 account of his work by Sir Humphrey Davy, the images formed by means of a camera obscura have been found too faint to produce, in any moderate time, an effect upon the nitrate of silver. To copy these images was the first object of Mr. Wedgwood in his researches on the subject, and for this purpose he first used the nitrate of silver, which was mentioned to him by a friend, as a substance very sensible to the influence of light, but all his numerous experiments as to the primary end proved unsuccessful. Development in France. In 1829, French artist and chemist Louis-Jaques-Mandé Daguerre, when obtaining a camera obscura for his work on theatrical scene painting from the optician Chevalier, was put into contact with Nice A4NIE Acute PCE, who had already managed to make a record of an image from a camera obscura using the process NIE Acute PCE invented, heliography. Daguerre met with NIE Acute PCE and entered into correspondence with him. NIE Acute PCE had invented an early internal combustion engine together with his brother Claude and made improvements to the velocipede, as well as experimenting with lithography and related processes. Their correspondence reveals that NIE Acute PCE was at first reluctant to divulge any details of his work with photographic images, to guard against letting any secrets out before the invention had been improved. They used a numerical code for security. 15, for example, signified the tanning action of the sun on human skin. 34, a camera obscura. 74, sulfuric acid. NIE Acute PCE and Daguerre's collaboration resulted in an improvement to the heliography process that they called the phototype. They drew up a formal agreement whereby it was anticipated that the invention would eventually be paid for by subscriptions from users, but this scheme eventually did not prove a success, as once the secret was out, the process would be available to anyone. Daguerre continued experimenting after NIE Acute PCE's death, which resulted in the daguerreotype process. NIE Acute PCE's son and heir, Isidore, had been written into the agreement. However, Isidore did not contribute anything to the invention of the daguerreotype, and he was not let in on the details of the invention. Nevertheless, he benefited from the state pension awarded to him together with Daguerre. Daguerre sought patents in England and Scotland, but during this time the astronomer and member of the House of Deputies Arago had sought a solution whereby the invention was to be given free to the world by the passing of acts in the French Parliament. However, the attempt to secure letters patent on the invention proved successful in Great Britain, and Beard controlled most of the licenses throughout the country with the exception of Antoine Claudette, who had purchased a license direct from Daguerre. In the US, Alexander Walcott invented the mirror daguerreotype camera, which made portrait likenesses on tiny plates so as to concentrate the light. Double mirrors outside the studio window, one facing the sky and another one reflecting upwards, further intensified the available window light. Walcott's father, on traveling to England and making inquiries, discovered that Richard Beard had bought from Daguerre's patent agent the control of licenses for Great Britain, and Beard bought Walcott's patent to produce daguerreotypes by means of the mirror camera and Walcott's improvements to the process that used bromine, and set up a studio on the rooftop of the Royal Polytechnic in Regent Street, London. Antoine Claudette had purchased a license from Daguerre directly to produce daguerreotypes. He was originally a representative of a French glass works with a shop in High Holborn at one stage. Beard sued Claudette with the aim of claiming that he had a monopoly of daguerreotype in England, but lost. Acute PCE's aim originally had been to find a method to reproduce prints and drawings for lithography. He had started out experimenting with light-sensitive materials and had made a contact print from a drawing and then went on to successfully make the first photomechanical record of an image in a camera obscura, the world's first photograph. Acute PCE's method was to coat a pewter plate with bitumen of Judea, and the action of the light differentially hardened the bitumen. The plate was washed with a mixture of oil of lavender and turpentine, leaving a relief image. Later, Daguerre's and Acute PCE's improvement to the heliograph process, the daguerreotype, reduced the exposure to 8 hours. Early experiments required hours of exposure in the camera to produce visible results. Modern photo historians consider the stories of Daguerre discovering mercury development by accident because of a bowl of mercury left in a cupboard, or alternatively a broken thermometer, to be spurious. However, there is another story of a fortunate accident, related by Louis-Jaques, of a silver spoon lying on an iodized silver plate which left its design on the plate by light perfectly. Noticing this, Daguerre wrote to Acute PCE on the 21st of May 1831 suggesting the use of iodized silver plates as a means of obtaining light images in the camera. Letters from Acute PCE to Daguerre dated the 24th of June and the 8th of November 1831 show that Acute PCE was unsuccessful in obtaining satisfactory results following Daguerre's suggestion. Although he had produced a negative on an iodized silver plate in the camera, Acute PCE's letters to Daguerre dated the 29th of January and the 3rd of March 1832 show that the use of iodized silver plates was due to Daguerre and not Acute PCE. Jean-Baptiste Sabatier-Blot, who was president of the National Society for the Encouragement of Science and a chemist, put his laboratory at Daguerre's disposal. According to Austrian chemist Joseph Maria Eder, Daguerre was not versed in chemistry, and it was Dumas who suggested Daguerre use sodium hyposulfite, discovered by Herschel in 1819 as a fixer to dissolve the unexposed silver salts. First mentioned in print and public announcement, a paragraph tacked onto the end of a review of one of Daguerre's diorama spectacles in the journal des Artistes on the 27th of September 1835. A diorama painting of a landslide that occurred in La Vallée de Gilding made passing mention of rumor that was going around the Paris studios of Daguerre's attempts to make a visual record on metal plates of the fleeting image produced by the camera obscura. It is said that Daguerre has found the means to collect, on a plate prepared by him, the image produced by the camera obscura, in such a way that a portrait, a landscape, or any view projected upon this plate by the ordinary camera obscura leaves an imprint in light and shade there, and thus presents the most perfect of all drawings. A preparation put over this image preserves it for an indefinite time. The physical sciences have perhaps never presented a marvel comparable to this one. A further clue to fixing the date of invention of the process is that when the Paris correspondent of the London periodical The Athenaeum reported the public announcement of the daguerreotype in 1839, he mentioned that the daguerreotypes now being produced were considerably better than the ones he had seen 4 years earlier. François Arago announced the daguerreotype process at a joint meeting of the French Academy of Sciences and the Académie des Beaux-Arts on the 9th of January, 1839. Daguerre was present, but complained of a sore throat. Later that year, William Fox Talbot announced his silver chloride sensitive paper process. Together, these announcements caused commentators to choose the 1839 as the year photography was born, or made public. Although of course Daguerre had been producing daguerreotypes since 1835 and kept the process secret, Daguerre and Nie had together signed an agreement in which remuneration for the invention would be paid for by subscription. However, the campaign they launched to finance the invention failed. François Arago, whose views on the system of patenting inventions can be gathered from speeches he made later in the House of Deputies, did not think the idea of raising money by subscription to be a good one, and supported Daguerre by arranging for motions to be passed in both houses of the French Parliament. Daguerre did not patent and profit from his invention in the usual way. Instead, it was arranged that the French government would acquire the rights in exchange for a lifetime pension. The government would then present the daguerreotype process, free to the world, as a gift, which it did on the 19th of August 1839. However, 5 days previously to this, Miles Berry, a patent agent acting on Daguerre's behalf, filed for patent No. 8194 of 1839, a new or improved method of obtaining the spontaneous reproduction of all the images received in the focus of the camera obscura. The patent applied to England, Wales, and the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, and in all Her Majesty's colonies and plantations abroad. Quote, "This was the usual wording of English patent specifications before 1852. It was only after the 1852 Act, which unified the patent systems of England, Ireland and Scotland, that of single patent protection was automatically extended to the whole of the British Isles, including the Channel Isles and the Isle of Man. Richard Beard bought the patent rights from Miles Berry, and also obtained a Scottish patent, which he apparently did not enforce. The United Kingdom and the colonies and plantations abroad therefore became the only places where a license was legally required to make and sell daguerreotypes. Much of Daguerre's early work was destroyed when his home and studio caught fire on the 8th of March 1839. While the painter Samuel Morse was visiting from the U.S., Malcolm Daniel points out that fewer than 25 securely attributed photographs by Daguerre survive, a mere handful of still lifes, Parisian views, and portraits from the dawn of photography. Camera obscura. The camera obscura in its simplest form is a naturally occurring phenomenon. When a hole in the wall of a dark room faces a brightly lit scene, or a small opening in the side of a cave on the edge of a sunlit valley does the same, an image of the scene outside will be projected upside down onto any surface opposite to the hole, more or less distinct depending on the size of the hole and the distance to the surface. Early camerae obscurae were entire rooms tightly shuttered except for a small hole. In the 16th century, Daniele Barbaro suggested replacing the small hole with a larger hole and an old man's spectacle lens, which produced a much brighter and sharper image. By the late 1700s, small, easily portable box film units equipped with a simple lens, an internal mirror, and a ground glass screen had become popular among affluent amateurs for making sketches of landscapes and architecture. The camera was pointed at the scene and steadied. A sheet of thin paper was placed on top of the ground glass. Then a pencil or pen could be used to trace over the image projected from within. The beautiful but fugitive little light paintings on the screen inspired several people to seek some way of capturing them more completely and effectively and automatically by means of chemistry. Daguerre, a skilled professional artist, was familiar with the camera obscura as an aid for establishing correct proportion and perspective, sometimes very useful when planning out the celebrated theatrical scene backdrops he painted and the even larger ultra-realistic panoramas he exhibited in his popular diorama plate manufacture. The daguerreotype image is formed on a highly polished silver surface. Usually the silver is a thin layer on a copper substrate. but other metals such as brass can be used for the substrate, and daguerreotypes can also be made on solid silver sheets. A surface of very pure silver is preferable, but sterling, a US coin, or even lower grades of silver are functional. In 19th century practice, the usual stock material, Sheffield plate, was produced by a process sometimes called plating by fusion. A sheet of sterling silver was heat fused onto the top of a thick copper ingot. When the ingot was repeatedly rolled under pressure to produce thin sheets, the relative thicknesses of the two layers of metal remained constant. The alternative was to electroplate a layer of pure silver onto a bare copper sheet. The two technologies were sometimes combined, the Sheffield plate being given a finishing coat of pure silver by electroplating, in order that the corners of the plate would not tear the buffing material when the plate was polished. In the US, the corners were clipped, while in France they were bent back. A number of devices were patented to do this, some of them also bending the edges of the plate as well as acting as plate holders to avoid touching the surface of the plate during processing. The process, polishing, to optimize the image quality of the end product. The silver side of the plate had to be polished to as nearly perfect a mirror finish as possible. The silver had to be completely free of tarnish or other contamination when it was sensitized, so the daguerreotypist had to perform at least the final portion of the polishing and cleaning operation not too long before use. In the 19th century, the polishing was done with a buff covered with Haida velvet, first using rotten stone, then jeweler's rouge, then lamp black. Originally, the work was entirely manual, but buffing machinery was soon devised to assist. Finally, the surface was swabbed with nitric acid to burn off any residual organic matter. Sensitization in darkness by the light of a safe light. The silver surface was exposed to halogen fumes. Originally, only iodine fumes were used, producing a surface coating of silver iodide. But it was soon found that of subsequent exposure to bromine fumes greatly increased the sensitivity of the silver halide coating. Exposure to chlorine fumes, or a combination of bromine and chlorine fumes, could also be used. A final refuming with iodine was typical. Exposure. The plate was then carried to the camera in a light plate holder. Withdrawing a protective dark slide or opening a pair of doors in the holder exposed the sensitized surface within the dark camera, and removing a cap from the camera lens began the exposure, creating an invisible latent image on the plate. Depending on the sensitization chemistry used, the brightness of the lighting, and the light concentrating power of the lens, the required exposure time ranged from a few seconds to many minutes. After the exposure was judged to be complete, the lens was capped and the holder was again made light tight and removed from the camera. Development. The latent image was developed to visibility by several minutes of exposure to the fumes given off by heated mercury in a purpose-made developing box. The toxicity of mercury was well known in the 19th century, but precautionary measures were rarely taken. Today, however, the hazards of contact with mercury and other chemicals traditionally used in the daguerreotype process are taken more seriously, as is the risk of release of those chemicals into the environment. In the Becquerel variation of the process, published in 1840 but very seldom used in the 19th century, the plate, sensitized by fuming with iodine alone, was developed by overall exposure to sunlight passing through yellow or red glass. The silver iodide in its unexposed condition was insensitive to the red end of the visible spectrum of light and was unaffected, but the latent image created in the camera by the blue, violet and ultraviolet rays color sensitized each point on the plate proportionally, so that this color-filtered, sun-bathed, intensified it to full visibility, as if the plate had been exposed in the camera 4 hours a day to produce a visible image without development. Fixing. After development, the light sensitivity of the plate was arrested by removing the remaining silver halide with a mild solution of sodium thiosulfate. Daguerre's initial method was to use a hot saturated solution of common salt. Gilding, also called gold toning, was an addition to Daguerre's process introduced by Hippolyte Fizeau in 1840. It soon became part of the standard procedure, to give the steely gray image a slightly warmer tone and physically reinforce the powder-like silver particles of which it was composed. A gold chloride solution was poured onto the surface and the plate was briefly heated over a flame, then drained, rinsed and dried. Without this treatment the image was as delicate as the dust on a butterfly's wing. Casing and other display options. Even when strengthened by gilding, the image surface was still very easily marred and the silver was subject to tarnishing from exposure to the air, so the finished plate was bound up with a protective cover glass and sealed with strips of paper soaked in gum arabic. In the US and UK, a gilt brass mat was normally used to separate the image surface from the glass. In continental Europe, a thin cardboard mat or passepartout usually served that purpose. There were two main methods of finishing daguerreotypes for protection and display. In the US and Britain, the tradition of preserving miniature paintings in a wooden case covered with leather or paper stamped with a relief pattern continued through to the daguerreotype. Some daguerreotypists were portrait artists who also offered miniature portraits. Black lacquered cases ornamented with inset mother-of-pearl were sometimes used. The more substantial union case was made from a mixture of colored sawdust and shellac formed in a heated mold to produce a decorative sculptural relief. The word union referred to the sawdust and varnish mixture. The manufacture of union cases began in 1856. In all types of cases, the inside of the cover was lined with velvet or plush or satin to provide a dark surface to reflect into the plate for viewing and to protect the cover glass. Some cases, however, held two daguerreotypes opposite each other. The cased images could be set out on a table or displayed on a mantelpiece. Most cases were small and lightweight enough to easily carry in a pocket, although that was not normally done. The other approach, common in France and the rest of continental Europe, was to hang the daguerreotype on the wall in a frame, either simple or elaborate. Conservators were able to determine that a daguerreotype of Walt Whitman was made in New Orleans, with the main clue being the type of frame, which was made for wall hanging in the French and continental style. Supporting evidence of the New Orleans origin was a scrap of paper from Le Messager, a New Orleans bilingual newspaper of the time, which had been used to glue to the plate into the frame. Other clues used by historians to identify daguerreotypes are hallmarks in the silver plate and the distinctive patterns left by different photographers when polishing the plate with a leather bar, which leaves extremely fine parallel lines discernible on the surface, as the daguerreotype itself is on a relatively thin sheet of soft metal. It was easily sheared down to sizes and shapes suited for mounting into lockets, as was done with miniature paintings. Other imaginative uses of daguerreotype portraits were to mount them in watch fobs and watch cases, jewel caskets and other ornate silver or gold boxes, the handles of walking sticks, and in brooches, bracelets and other jewelry now referred to by collectors as Daguerrean jewelry. The cover glass or crystal was sealed either directly to the edges of the daguerreotype or to the opening of its receptacle, and a protective hinged cover was usually provided.